From betrayal to murder. The wife who exposed a business tycoon's empire. She thought her life was ordinary, until a shocking betrayal turned everything upside down. What would you do if you found out your husband was hiding a deadly secret? This woman is about to discover the terrifying truth, and the game is far from over. Emma stood frozen, the weight of the gunshots still echoing in her ears. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Her eyes flickered from the lifeless body of her husband to the boy, crying in the corner. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The man who had killed her husband stood over the body, his hand still gripping the gun. Blood was spreading across the floor, staining everything in its path. It felt unreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The man's eyes met hers. There was no remorse, no hesitation, only cold, calculated intent. "Why?" Emma whispered, her voice hoarse. The man didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be considering her for the first time, as though he hadn't quite expected her to survive. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said finally, his voice eerily calm. "But he left me no choice." Emma's pulse quickened, her mind trying to make sense of his words. Her husband had done this, had brought them all here, to this moment of violence? The man took a step toward her, the gun still in his hand. "No. Please," Emma choked out, the terror rising in her chest. The boy continued to sob, unaware of the full extent of what had just happened. But Emma knew. She knew that everything was lost. This was no longer just a betrayal of a wife. It was something far darker, something deeper. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You see," he said, his voice low and steady, "your husband. He was the one pulling all the strings." Emma's blood ran cold. "What? What do you mean?" she stammered, struggling to hold herself together. The man walked over to the window, looking out over the city below. "There's a lot you don't know about him, about his business, about the empire he built." He turned back to her, his expression hardening. "He's been laundering money for years. A criminal empire, running right under your nose." Emma couldn't breathe. The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her husband, the man she had loved, the man who had built their life together, was a criminal, and now he was dead. "But why kill him?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man smirked, though his eyes were empty. "He was weak," he said simply. "He wasn't in control anymore. He was going to ruin everything I've built." Emma tried to steady herself. The room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Her husband had been involved in something far worse than she could have imagined. But why kill him in front of her? Why bring her into this nightmare? Before she could speak, the man moved toward the boy, crouching beside him. The child had stopped crying for a moment, looking up at the man with wide eyes. "This is your new reality now, kid," the man said softly. "Your father is gone." Emma's heart clenched. She couldn't let this happen. But what could she do? She was alone. The man stood up, turning his attention back to Emma. "You're going to walk out of here," he said, his voice cold. "You're going to leave, and you're going to forget everything." Emma's mind spun. Leave? How could she leave? Everything in her screamed for justice, for answers. But she knew there would be none. She had already seen too much. The man moved toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. Emma couldn't take her eyes off the boy, still standing there, lost and terrified. And the blood. It was everywhere. Her husband's blood. Her world. Broken and scattered around her. "Go," the man repeated. Now, for a moment, Emma hesitated. Her feet felt like lead. But then, something in her snapped. She didn't care what he said. She wasn't going to leave like this. Not without understanding. Not without something, anything, to make sense of all this. She moved toward the door, but just as she reached for the handle, a voice stopped her. It was the boy. his small, fragile voice. "Are you going to leave me too?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma froze. She turned back toward him, the tears welling in her eyes. She didn't know how to answer him, but she knew one thing. She couldn't walk out of this house. Not like this. Not with the boy left alone. Before she could speak, the man looked at her, a cold warning in his gaze. "Make your choice," he said flatly. She had no choice. Not anymore. She turned to face the man one last time, her heart racing, her mind torn. But she knew she couldn't leave that boy behind. She had to make him see. She had to make him understand. And she would. One way or another, the man's eyes were burning with rage as he stepped closer, the gun still aimed directly at Emma. She stood frozen, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Her heart was pounding, but there was no fear left. She had made her choice. The boy was free. That was all that mattered now. She took a slow, steadying breath, her eyes never leaving the man. His fingers twitched around the trigger. The sound of his breathing was the only thing filling the room. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he spat, his voice low and threatening. Emma didn't respond. She couldn't. But her mind was racing, calculating, looking for an escape. She needed to get out. She needed to move. And yet, in that moment, she felt strangely calm. She wasn't going to die here. Not like this. The man took another step forward, the floor creaking under his weight. His eyes were calculating, studying her every move, like a predator toying with its prey. "Do you know how much I've built?" he asked, his voice eerily quiet. "How long I've been running this operation? How many people I've crushed to get where I am?" Emma said nothing. She didn't need to hear it. She had already seen enough. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he sneered. "You're nothing. Just a woman who got in the way." His finger twitched again. The gun was almost ready to fire. Emma's mind raced. Her eyes darted around, looking for anything she could use, any advantage. Then her gaze fell on the door. It was slightly ajar, and behind the door, she could see the hallway, the staircase, the exit. She didn't have much time. She was already too close to him, but before she could react, he lunged forward. The gunshot rang out, but Emma wasn't there. She had ducked just in time, the bullet missing her by mere inches. The man cursed, his body jerking with frustration as he tried to adjust the gun to get a clean shot. Emma's heart was in her throat. This was it. Her body moved on its own. She was out of time. She darted toward the hallway, her legs propelling her forward as fast as they could carry her. Another shot fired, but this time it hit the wall behind her. She was already at the stairs, her fingers gripping the railing as she hurriedly ascended. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let him get to her. The door at the top of the stairs loomed ahead. The exit. Her escape. She could hear him behind her, moving fast, his footsteps pounding the floor. He wasn't far behind, but she had to make it. She reached the door. Her fingers fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't open. The lock. She could hear his footsteps getting closer. The door wasn't giving way. Panic surged through her veins. She twisted the handle again, harder this time, pushing with all her strength. The sound of his footsteps was deafening now. He was almost there. Finally, with a sharp tug, the door opened. She was free. For a moment, she stood in the doorway, the cool night air rushing against her skin. But she didn't stop. She ran, down the stairs, around the corner, through the alleyway. The world around her was a blur. Her mind was consumed by one thought: escape. She couldn't look back. Not yet. Emma's chest tightened with each step, her feet pounding against the concrete as she sprinted down the narrow path. The sound of the man's footsteps was gone. Had he stopped? Or was he still chasing her? She didn't know. She couldn't afford to know. She reached the end of the alley and burst onto the main street, where the dim light from street lamps illuminated the night. The city felt distant now, cold and indifferent. She didn't care. She had to get away. Her legs were burning. Her body was exhausted. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. And then she heard it. A car engine. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. She turned. The headlights hit her eyes, blinding her for a moment. But she didn't hesitate. She ran straight for the car. The vehicle screeched to a halt in front of her. The window rolled down. "Get in," the driver shouted. Without a second thought, Emma jumped inside. The door slammed shut behind her. She collapsed against the seat, breathing heavily, her body trembling. The car sped off into the night, the sound of the tires gripping the asphalt drowned out by the roar of her heart. She had no idea who this was, but for now she didn't care. All she cared about was getting away from that place, from the nightmare that had just unfolded. The man, her husband, the boy. Her thoughts were a blur, the world spinning. "Are you okay?" the driver asked, his voice full of concern. Emma barely heard him. She nodded, barely able to hold it together. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. What she had just escaped wasn't over. The car sped through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic. As Emma tried to steady her breathing, her heart was still racing. Her hands were trembling, clutched tightly in her lap. She could still see his face, the man with the gun. Could still hear the echo of the shots, the way her husband's body had crumpled to the floor. It felt like it was all happening in slow motion, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The driver didn't speak again for several minutes. He kept his eyes focused on the road, but Emma could feel his gaze flickering toward her from time to time. His presence was reassuring, but at the same time, the silence between them was suffocating. The city passed by in flashes, neon signs, dimly lit streets, the occasional pedestrian unaware of the chaos that had just erupted just a few miles away. Finally, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She had to ask. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The man glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "I'm someone who's been watching," he replied cryptically, his voice calm but distant. "Watching," Emma repeated, confusion clouding her mind. "Who are you to me?" The man didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his hands steady on the wheel. He drove with a practiced ease, as if he had done this 100 times before. "I'm here to help you," he said finally, his tone calm, almost detached. "Help me," Emma echoed, still trying to process everything. Her mind was a storm of questions. "Why?" she asked, shaking her head. "What do you want from me?" The man let out a slow breath, as if considering his answer carefully. "I don't want anything from you," he said simply. "But your husband, he was part of something bigger? Something dangerous?" Emma's stomach tightened. She felt like she was about to be sick. "He wasn't just some businessman, Emma," the driver continued, his voice lowering. "He was a key player in an international network. Money laundering, illegal trade. And he made enemies. Powerful enemies." Emma's head spun. The man had been lying to her all along. The empire he had built, the one she thought was legitimate, was a front for something far darker. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Are you saying you knew all along?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You knew what he was doing?" The driver's eyes flicked to her again, just for a moment. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I knew," he said simply, "and I know you weren't a part of it. You were just a pawn, a victim." Emma's chest tightened as the truth began to sink in. Her husband, her life, had been a lie. Everything she had trusted, everything she had built with him, it was all part of a game. a game she had never known she was playing. She felt sick to her stomach. Her mind reeled. "Why are you helping me then?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What do you want from me?" The driver's expression remained hard, unreadable. "I'm not doing this for you," he said quietly, his voice edged with something darker. "I'm doing it because the people who wanted your husband gone, they won't stop. They know you saw what happened. They know you were there." Emma's breath hitched. She had only been trying to escape. She had only been trying to survive. "They'll come after you," the man said, his voice cold. "They'll come after you and anyone you care about. You won't be safe. Not unless you listen to me." Emma turned her head to look out the window, trying to block out the rising panic inside her chest. She had thought the worst was over, but now the reality was sinking in. Her husband's criminal empire wasn't just some bad decision. It was a force, an unstoppable one. And now she was in the crosshairs. "Why would you want to help me?" she repeated, still trying to make sense of it. The man finally spoke again, his tone quieter now, but the gravity in his voice was unmistakable. "Because I know who's behind this, and I can help you disappear." Emma's head snapped back to him, her heart skipping a beat. "Disappear?" She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was spinning, trying to understand the offer, trying to understand what he meant. "We can get you out of the country," he continued, his eyes glancing at her once more. "We can erase your tracks. Start fresh. You'll be safe. You won't be a target anymore." Emma's mind was racing. She had no idea who this man was or why he was doing this. But in that moment, she realized that she had no choice. There was no turning back now. She was already in too deep. Her life had been shattered in an instant, and the pieces weren't going to fit together again. "You're going to have to trust me," the man said, his voice steady. Trust him? She didn't know if she could, but she didn't have much of a choice. "I'll help you," he said, almost as if reading her thoughts. "But you have to keep moving. You can't stop. Not until we're safe." Emma closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She nodded slowly. Whatever this man had planned, whatever dark world he was pulling her into, she didn't have a choice. It was the only way to survive. And at this point, survival was the only thing that mattered. The car sped through the night, the lights of the city flickering past like distant stars. Emma stared straight ahead, her mind still struggling to piece together the chaos that had shattered her life. She could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. Her husband, the life she thought she knew, was gone. Everything she had trusted was a lie. And now, this man, this stranger, was offering her an escape, a chance to disappear. She had no choice but to accept. Her hands gripped the seat tightly as the car continued down the darkened road. The city seemed to blur into the background, the constant hum of the engine filling the silence between them. She wanted to ask him more. What did he know? How did he know so much about her husband? But she didn't. She was too afraid of the answers. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the tires on the road, the occasional hum of the engine as they cut through the night. Finally, the man broke the silence. "Do you want to know who did it?" he asked, his voice low. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Did she? She wasn't sure she could handle the truth, but the question hung in the air like a heavy fog, impossible to ignore. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man glanced at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before his eyes returned to the road. "It wasn't just some random act of violence," he said, his voice colder now. "It was orchestrated, planned. Your husband was part of something much bigger." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much, but hearing him say it out loud made the nightmare feel real. "Who were they?" she asked, her voice shaking. The man's grip on the wheel tightened for a brief moment. "I can't tell you everything," he said, his tone sharp. But I'll tell you what you need to know. Your husband had debts. Dangerous ones. People who don't just let things slide. They don't forgive. Emma turned her head to look at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Who? She asked, her voice rising. Who would do this? The man's gaze flickered to hers again, his jaw clenching. People you don't want to cross. People who own half this city. The kind of people who have everything and don't hesitate to take whatever they want. Emma's stomach twisted. The faces of her husband's colleagues flashed in her mind, but they didn't fit the picture he was painting. These weren't just business partners. These were criminals. A part of her wanted to deny it, to push the thought away, but she couldn't. It was all making too much sense now. The pieces were falling into place. Your husband was a pawn, the man continued, his voice grim. He was expendable. Just another player in a much larger game. Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine. A pawn. That was all he had been. The man glanced at her again, his expression hardening. They'll be looking for you, he said, his voice lower now. You've seen too much, heard too much. They won't stop until you're silenced. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Silenced. She could already feel the weight of the target on her back, the fear gnawing at her insides. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. We're going to a safe house, he finally said, his tone calm but firm. It's the first step. You'll need to stay there until we figure out our next move. Emma's head spun. Safe house. What kind of life was she stepping into? She had no choice but to follow him, to do what he said. But what did that even mean? She was already too far gone. I'm not going to ask you to trust me, the man said, breaking her thoughts. But I'll get you through this. I have the means to make it happen. All you have to do is stay low, keep quiet, and keep moving. Emma turned her gaze to the window, watching the passing lights streak across the dark sky. She couldn't believe what was happening to her. One moment, she had been living a normal life, a life she thought was full of love and security. Now, she was running for her life. She didn't know where it would end, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stop now. Not when the danger was this close. And not when she had seen just how far this criminal empire was willing to go to protect its secrets. The car veered off the main road, taking a sharp turn onto a narrow street. Emma felt a growing sense of dread as they passed through the quiet neighborhood. Here we are, the man said, slowing the car to a stop in front of a modest house, tucked away in a corner. It was nothing special, nothing that would attract attention. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the man shifted into park. You'll be safe here, he said as he turned off the engine. Safe. For how long? She wasn't sure, but at least for now it was the only option she had. Stay close, the man said as he opened the door. And don't trust anyone. Not even me. Emma swallowed hard. She stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady beneath her. She was too exhausted, too broken. But there was no turning back now. As the door closed behind her, Emma took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever came next. Her life had just become a war zone, and she was now a soldier in a battle she had never asked for. The man motioned toward the door of the house. Let's move, he said, his voice steady. Emma followed him inside. The door shut behind them, sealing her fate. And the darkness of the night swallowed everything whole. The door clicked shut with an unsettling finality. Emma stood there in the dimly lit hallway, her pulse racing. The silence felt suffocating. The house was modest, small, but it had a cold, unwelcoming feel. There were no personal touches, no warmth. Just the sterile emptiness of a place meant for hiding, not living. The man moved ahead of her, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. He didn't look back. Stay here, he said, his voice calm, almost clinical. I'll make sure you're safe for the time being, but we have to stay low." Emma nodded numbly, though her thoughts were scattered. Her mind was still reeling from the shock of the last few hours. Her husband dead. A criminal empire she never knew existed. The boy, she had no idea what happened to him. Everything was falling apart. The man disappeared into another room, leaving Emma standing alone in the hallway. She glanced around. Everything in the house seemed functional, but there was no sign of life. No family photos, no belongings, just a sparse, utilitarian existence. Her gaze wandered to the window. Through the slats of the blinds, she could just make out the silhouette of a car parked down the street. It didn't look familiar, but a sense of unease settled over her. She had been running for so long, and now even the quiet seemed to hold danger. Her body was exhausted, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. What had the man meant when he said to keep moving? What did he know about her husband's enemies? And more importantly, what did they want from her? She tried to push the questions away. They only made the fear worse, but they kept coming back. The weight of the unknown pressed down on her chest, suffocating. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. She turned, her body stiffening. The man was back, holding a small black bag. He was moving swiftly, efficiently. "We leave in the morning," he said without explanation, as if everything was already decided. Emma opened her mouth to ask why, but he cut her off before she could speak. "I'll get you supplies. You'll need to be ready to go. We can't stay here long." "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why can't we just stay here?" The man's eyes flashed briefly with something she couldn't quite read. "There are people looking for you," he said, his voice hard. "And they'll be looking here soon. This place is compromised." Emma's stomach tightened. It was already happening. The man stepped toward the door, his movements quick and purposeful. "Get some sleep," he instructed. "You'll need your strength." He disappeared again, this time heading toward the back of the house. Emma's feet felt like they were glued to the floor. She glanced at the stairs leading to the second floor. There was a small bedroom at the top, a thin slice of light spilling from beneath the door. Her legs carried her up the stairs, almost instinctively. The house felt even colder as she ascended. The silence was unbearable now. She reached the bedroom door and paused, her hand hovering over the knob. What if this was all a trap? What if she was walking into a nightmare, even worse than the one she had already lived through? The man's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, don't trust anyone. Not even me. Asterisk. But she didn't have a choice. There was no one else to turn to. She opened the door. The room was simple, with just a bed, a desk, and a small wardrobe. It looked almost like a hotel room, impersonal and utilitarian. She stepped inside, her feet moving almost automatically. The bed looked inviting. Her body ached. Her mind screamed for rest. But as she lay down, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. She pulled the thin blanket up over her shoulders, trying to find some comfort in the softness. But her thoughts were far too loud. What had she gotten herself into? She stared at the ceiling, her eyes tracing the shadows in the dim light. She heard the faint sounds of movement downstairs. The man was still there, still moving, still planning. And Emma was trapped in a world she never made. Time seemed to drag on, stretching into an endless abyss. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. She thought about the boy. Was he safe? Where had he gone? Her mind swirled with images of his tear-streaked face, the fear in his eyes. He had been just as much a victim as she was, and now they were both caught in the same web. Her eyelids fluttered, the weight of the day dragging her down. She had barely fallen asleep when a sudden noise jerked her awake. A door creaking, a floorboard shifting. She sat up in bed, heart pounding in her chest. Was it the man, or was someone else here? Her breathing quickened, her body tense. She could hear the faint sound of whispers, voices coming from downstairs. But there was something strange about them. Too quiet, too controlled. She moved to the door slowly, carefully, her feet almost silent on the wooden floor. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Was this it? Had they found her already? The whispers grew louder. She needed to know. Emma opened the door just a crack, peering through the gap. She saw the man in the living room talking to someone else, someone she didn't recognize. The other figure was tall, wearing a dark coat, and the way they stood motionless, like a predator waiting for its prey, sent a chill down Emma's spine. The conversation was too low to make out any words, but the tension in the air was palpable. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The man glanced toward the stairs. Emma's breath caught in her throat. He knew she was awake. But what was he hiding? And who was this new person? She couldn't hear them anymore. Had they seen her? She couldn't wait any longer. She had to make a decision. Do nothing and wait for the unknown to come to her. Or act now. But one thing was certain. Nothing was going to be the same after tonight. Her hand trembled on the doorknob. She couldn't stay here. Not with him. Not with the stranger. The silence stretched long and heavy, suffocating, and her instinct screamed at her to move. But where? She had no plan, no escape route. She didn't know who to trust anymore. The man downstairs. Had he betrayed her already? Her breath hitched, and she pressed her back against the door, trying to listen for any sign that they were coming toward her. The air felt thick with danger. Her mind raced, piecing together what little she knew. Her husband's enemies, the criminal empire, the boy. None of it made sense anymore. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. Emma stepped back from the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to make a choice. The bedroom window was small, but it wasn't too far to the ground. If she could just climb out, maybe she could disappear into the night. But what if they were waiting for her? What if she ran straight into the hands of those who wanted her dead? Her body was stiff with fear. Her legs refused to move. But then she heard something, footsteps. They were moving toward the stairs. She couldn't stay here. She had no idea what their intentions were, but if they had found her, if they had come this far, it was too late to turn back now. She rushed to the window, her heart hammering in her chest. She yanked it open. The cool night air rushed in, sending a shiver down her spine. It was dark outside, the streetlights casting faint pools of yellow light on the pavement below. The ground was about 10 feet away, manageable if she was careful. Her mind flashed to the man downstairs. Had he sold her out? Was the stranger here to finish what the others had started? There was no time to waste. Emma climbed through the window, forcing her body through the tight space. Her fingers scraped against the sill, and she winced as her legs dangled for a moment before she dropped to the ground below. She landed with a soft thud, her knees buckling from the impact. But she didn't stop. She pushed herself to her feet and sprinted into the shadows, running down the narrow alley between the houses, her feet slapping against the pavement. She could hear the sounds of the house behind her. Footsteps, doors opening, but she didn't dare look back. Every breath she took felt like a jagged knife in her chest, but her legs carried her forward, faster and faster, until she reached the end of the alley. She stumbled into the street, the dim lights above her guiding the way. For a moment, she didn't know where to go. The city felt enormous, overwhelming. Where's she supposed to go now? But the moment of indecision didn't last long. A car's headlights flashed in the distance. She had no idea who was in it, but her heart leaped at the sight of it. Without thinking, she ran toward it. She flagged it down, her heart in her throat, praying that whoever was inside would stop. The car screeched to a halt. The door swung open, and a figure stepped out. It was a woman mid-30s, with short dark hair and a tough, no-nonsense look in her eyes. She wore a leather jacket, and her hands were clenched at her sides. "Get in," the woman said, her voice low and urgent. Now, Emma didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind her. The woman didn't waste any time. She hit the gas and sped off, the tires screeching as they tore through the night. Emma's chest was heaving, her mind spinning. Who was this woman? Was she another part of the criminal world? "Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. The woman's gaze never left the road as she drove, her hands steady on the wheel. "We don't have time for explanations," she replied, her tone clipped. "We're getting you out of here. That's all you need to know." Emma's heart pounded harder. Getting her out of here? She had no idea where this woman was taking her, but the way she spoke, cold, controlled, it was clear she wasn't someone to mess with. "Where are we going?" Emma asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The woman's eyes flicked briefly to Emma before returning to the road. "Somewhere safe," she said, "but first we need to lose them. And if you want to stay alive, you'd better keep your head down and keep quiet." Emma's breath hitched. "They're coming after me, aren't they?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman nodded, her expression hardening. "They already know you're gone," she said. "They'll be searching every street, every alley. They'll track you no matter where you go. They won't stop until you're dead." The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. She had known the danger was real, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more terrifying. She glanced behind them through the rearview mirror. No sign of anyone following. Yet. "Stay down," the woman ordered, her voice turning sharp. "And don't make a sound." Emma sank lower in her seat, trying to shrink into the shadows. She didn't know who this woman was, but she didn't have a choice. The car tore through the night, the streets growing quieter as they left the city behind. It was just Emma and the stranger now. The two of them, alone in the darkness. And Emma couldn't help but wonder, who was really in control of her life now? And how long before the past caught up with her? The car's tires hummed over the quiet road, the city lights now far behind them. The woman drove with an unsettling calm, her focus unwavering as the landscape outside shifted from concrete and steel to empty stretches of darkened countryside. Emma sat low in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She was still trying to process everything, the murder, the escape, the woman in the leather jacket. Her mind couldn't catch up with the whirlwind of fear and confusion. "The same people who were after your husband," the woman replied. "The ones who would have killed you too, if you hadn't run." Emma's breath caught. Her husband's enemies, the ones she hadn't even known existed until just hours ago, now had their sights set on her. And this woman, whoever she was in the same boat. She glanced out the window at the passing scenery. The world outside seemed so still, so distant, as if everything had paused just for her. She didn't know how long they had been driving, but the road seemed endless. Every mile that passed felt like a mile further from the life she once knew. But the question kept gnawing at her. Why was this woman helping her? Emma turned her head slowly toward her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why are you helping me?" The woman's eyes flicked to her for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer right away. Emma's pulse quickened. Her thoughts were racing, trying to piece together anything that might make sense of this new, terrifying reality. What could possibly be in it for this woman? What did she want from Emma? Finally, after a long, tense silence, the woman spoke. "I'm not doing this for you," she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "I'm doing it because they're going to come for me too, eventually." Emma's stomach twisted. "Who?" she whispered. "The same people who were after your husband," the woman replied. "The ones who would have killed you too if you hadn't run." Emma's breath caught. Her husband's enemies, the ones she hadn't even known existed until just hours ago, now had their sights set on her. And this woman, whoever she was in the same boat. "But why do you care?" Emma asked. You don't know me. You don't know me anything. The woman's hands tightened around the wheel, her knuckles turning white. You're right. I don't owe you anything, she said, her voice colder now. But I've seen what happens to people like you. People who get caught up in this world without even knowing it. I've seen the damage they do. To families, to lives. Emma shuddered at the implication. This woman had seen it all, hadn't she? She'd been in the same game. Perhaps even longer than Emma had. Then what? Emma asked, her voice small. What happens now? The woman's gaze hardened, her eyes never leaving the road. Now we survive, she said, her tone final. Emma let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of the woman's words sink deep into her chest. It wasn't just about running anymore. It was about something bigger, something darker. Survive, Emma echoed, her voice barely a whisper. The woman nodded, glancing at her briefly before focusing back on the road. Survival means more than just staying alive, she said, her voice hardening. It means staying hidden, moving fast, and most importantly, it means trusting no one. Emma's heart pounded louder in her chest. Trusting no one. She'd trusted her husband, and look where that had gotten her. You're not the first person to get dragged into this, the woman continued, her voice low and steady. And you won't be the last. But I'm not going to let them catch you. Not if I can help it. Emma turned her eyes toward the darkness outside, her mind swirling with 1,000 questions. How long could they keep running? How long before they found her? The car suddenly slowed, and Emma sat up straighter, her instincts kicking in. The woman's eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror. I think we've lost them for now, she said, her voice still cool. But we can't stop yet. Emma nodded, barely able to focus on the woman's words. Her brain was still running on adrenaline, unable to slow down, unable to understand everything that was happening. The woman continued driving, her focus unwavering, her gaze darting to the mirrors every few seconds. They passed through small towns, empty gas stations, and fields that stretched on for miles. Emma had no idea where they were headed, but the road ahead felt endless, like they were moving further and further into the unknown. How do you know so much about my husband? Emma asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The woman's lips tightened, but she didn't seem surprised by the question. I told you, she said. I've seen what happens to people like you. Your husband wasn't just some businessman. He was tangled up in things much bigger than you ever realized. Emma's chest tightened at the words. It was as if she had been living in a world of shadows, unaware of the darkness that surrounded her. Who are these people? She asked, her voice rising. Why did they do this to him? To me? The woman glanced at her, her expression hardening. You really don't know, do you? She muttered, more to herself than to Emma. Your husband wasn't just a pawn. He was a tool, and he was good at what he did, but he got greedy. He tried to play both sides. Now, they've decided he's expendable. Emma's blood ran cold. Expendable. Her husband had been nothing more than a tool to them, a means to an end. And now they're coming for you, the woman added, her voice heavy with warning. You're in this now, whether you like it or not. You can't run forever. Emma swallowed hard. She had known deep down that there was no escaping this. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, the shadows would always be following her. She was trapped, and the only thing left to do was survive. The woman's voice broke through her thoughts. Get some rest. We'll be stopping soon. Emma didn't argue. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was still wide awake, racing with thoughts she couldn't contain. They drove on, further into the unknown, and Emma knew that no matter what came next, her life would never be the same again. Not after everything that had happened, and not after what was coming. The car hummed steadily down the deserted highway, the only sound the low rumble of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind outside. The woman's hands were firm on the wheel, her eyes scanning the road with a sharp, practiced focus. Emma, however, could barely keep her thoughts straight. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind was a whirlwind of questions, doubts, and terror. They hadn't stopped for hours, and the landscape had become a blur of endless stretches of darkened countryside. Emma's eyelids drooped, but every time she thought of closing her eyes, the harsh reality would slap her awake again. There was no comfort, no escape. The life she had known gone. Her husband gone. Her future uncertain. The woman beside her didn't seem to notice Emma's silence. Or maybe she didn't care. Either way, Emma didn't dare break the quiet. She had already asked enough questions, and the woman had given her little to go on. Her mind kept circling back to one thing. Who could she trust? And how much longer would she have before the past caught up to her? The car slowed suddenly, pulling off onto a small, poorly lit side road. Emma sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. It was the first sign of a stop in hours. The car turned onto a gravel driveway and slowed to a stop in front of a large, nondescript house, isolated, surrounded by trees and darkness. "Here we are," the woman said flatly, killing the engine. She didn't look at Emma as she opened the door. Emma hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Where was here? Was this a safe house? Or was it a trap? The woman got out without waiting for Emma, heading toward the house. She didn't glance back. Emma watched her for a moment, the unease crawling up her spine. She didn't want to go inside, but she had nowhere else to go, no other options. She had already come too far to turn back. She opened the door and stepped out, her legs weak from hours of sitting still. The air outside was cooler, the faint smell of damp earth mixed with the scent of pine trees. She followed the woman up the steps and into the house, each creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounding louder than it should in the heavy silence. Inside, the house was dark, save for a few dim lamps. It looked like a home, but not quite. The furniture was sparse, utilitarian. There were no personal touches, no photos, no decorations, just the essentials. The woman moved quickly through the house, heading to the kitchen. Emma lingered in the hallway, her eyes scanning the room, her nerves frayed. The house felt off. The walls seemed too still, like they were waiting for something or someone to disturb the silence. "Sit," the woman called from the kitchen, her voice cool and businesslike. Emma didn't argue. She moved toward the table, the wooden chair scraping softly as she pulled it out. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The woman appeared in the doorway, now holding a glass of water. She set it down in front of Emma. "You're safe here for now," the woman said, her tone flat. "But it won't be for long. We need to make plans." Emma stared at the water, her thoughts swirling. Safe. How could she be safe when the whole world had crumbled around her in the last 24 hours? The danger was still out there. It felt like a constant, oppressive weight. Every moment, every sound, made her feel like someone was waiting, watching, just beyond the corner. What's going to happen? Emma's voice was shaky, but she couldn't help it. She was done with the questions she couldn't ask. She needed answers, no matter how hard they were to hear. The woman didn't immediately respond. She stared at Emma for a long moment, her eyes hard and unreadable. "First thing," the woman said, breaking the silence, "we need to assume they're already looking for us. They'll come after us soon enough, and we need to be ready. We can't stay here for long." Emma nodded, trying to swallow the knot in her throat. "But who are they? Who is after me?" The woman exhaled slowly, her lips tightening as she considered the question. Then her eyes hardened. "They're the people your husband was mixed up with. Dangerous people. People who don't play by the rules. And they won't stop until they find you. They'll burn everything to the ground to get what they want." Emma's stomach twisted. Her husband had been part of something much bigger than she'd ever known. The ties that bound him were not just to business deals, not just to money. It was something darker, more dangerous. She could feel the weight of it pressing in on her chest. "Who are they?" she repeated, her voice nearly a whisper. "What do they want with me?" The woman looked away briefly, her expression hardening. "You really don't know, do you?" she said softly. "You don't know what your husband was involved in." Emma's mind raced, trying to grasp the pieces of the puzzle, but it was too much. She had been so sure of everything before, so sure of who her husband was, of who she was. Now it all felt like a lie. "Tell me," Emma insisted. "Please." The woman sighed heavily. She didn't seem like she wanted to talk, but Emma could see the hesitation in her eyes. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you," the woman said. "Your husband wasn't just making money through legal means. He was into a whole lot of illegal businesses, drug trafficking, arms dealing, money laundering. Whatever was profitable, he was in on it. And he wasn't just some player, he was at the top of the food chain. But he made enemies, big ones, and now they've come for him." Emma felt the room spin. The truth hit her like a freight train, and she couldn't catch her breath. All this time, all these years of marriage, of normalcy, it had been a facade. Her whole life had been a lie. Why did he do this?" Emma whispered. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he warn me?" The woman's face softened just slightly, but there was no sympathy in her eyes. Some people get so deep into it that they don't know how to get out. They don't want to risk dragging others down with them. But you're the collateral damage. You're here because he's gone. And now they'll stop at nothing to erase every trace of him. And you. Emma's chest tightened. It was too much to take in all at once. She wasn't just running from murders. She was running from the truth. And the worst part was, she didn't even know what she was running toward. The woman turned and walked toward the back of the house, her silhouette vanishing into the shadows. "We need to figure out what your next move is," she called over her shoulder. "You can't stay here forever. The moment they figure out where you are, you're done. Understand?" Emma stared after her, numb. There was no going back. Her life, her choices, her safety, it all hinged on what she did next. And she had no idea what that was. All she knew was that the woman had told her the truth, the brutal, unrelenting truth. Emma was in the eye of a storm, and the chaos was just beginning. The silence in the house felt suffocating as Emma sat there, her hands wrapped tightly around the cold glass of water in front of her. Her thoughts spun like a whirlwind, faster and faster, and she couldn't find a way to slow them down. The woman had left her alone, retreating into the shadows of the house. Emma could hear the faint sound of movement from the back room, but everything else was quiet. Too quiet. She looked around again, her eyes tracing the sparse furniture, the unadorned walls. Nothing felt real anymore. The life she'd built with her husband, the love they'd shared, the home they'd created together. It all seemed like a distant memory now, something she could never go back to. The weight of it all crushed down on her chest. She needed answers, but she didn't know who to trust. Not the woman who had saved her, not the man who had betrayed her, and certainly not the ghosts of her husband's past that seemed to be closing in on her. But the woman's words echoed in her mind. "You can't stay here forever." Emma stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as she moved toward the door. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Something to make this all feel real, maybe, or maybe just an escape from the heaviness that clung to the air. She stepped cautiously toward the hallway, her bare feet soft against the wooden floorboards. The house was eerily still. Emma reached the kitchen, where she had left the woman earlier, but there was no sign of her now. "Hello," Emma called softly, her voice faltering in the stillness. No answer. She stepped into the dimly lit kitchen, her senses alert. Something felt off. The air in here was thick with tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She froze in place. There, on the counter, a small stack of papers lay under a faint glow from the low lamp overhead. Curiosity drew her toward them. She had no reason to trust anything in this house, but she couldn't help herself. She needed answers, any answers. She picked up the top sheet of paper. Her hands shook as she read the words in front of her. It was a list. Names, numbers, addresses scrambled, as though someone had tried to hide them. But there, in the center of the page, one name stood out. David Carter. Her husband's name. Her breath caught in her throat. What was this? Was this his business? A list of his enemies? Or something worse? She flipped through the pages quickly, her eyes scanning the cryptic details. Every name was marked with a number, a location, and sometimes a strange code that she couldn't understand. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that her husband's name was at the center of it all. This is why they're after me, Emma thought, her heart hammering in her chest. This is what they want. Before she could process it further, a sound from behind her startled her. A soft footstep on the floor. She spun around, her body tensing. The woman stood there, leaning against the doorway, watching her with those unreadable eyes. "Did you find something?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp, like a blade just waiting to cut. Emma's hand tightened around the papers. Her pulse thudded in her ears. "What is this?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. But she could feel the panic creeping in. The woman's expression didn't change. She stepped into the room slowly, her movements purposeful, calculated. "It's what your husband was involved in," she said. "And it's what's going to get you killed if you don't understand how deep this goes." Emma's eyes narrowed. She wanted to shout, to demand more answers. She wanted to know why she had to be dragged into this nightmare. But the words wouldn't come. "Tell me the truth," Emma said, her voice shaky. "Everything. I need to know why my husband is dead. Why they're coming for me. Why—" "Your husband was a liability." The woman cut her off, her tone hard, cold. "He got greedy. Too greedy. And now, everyone connected to him is expendable. Even you." Emma's blood ran cold. "Expendable," she repeated, barely able to breathe. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved toward the counter, her eyes flicking over the papers that Emma had picked up. She grabbed one of the sheets and examined it with a look of grim understanding. "They think you know something you don't," the woman said, finally speaking again. "Something your husband left behind, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." "Get what?" Emma's voice was nearly a whisper now, her body trembling with the weight of the revelation. The woman hesitated before answering. She looked down at the paper in her hand, her lips pressed into a thin line. "The list," she said slowly. "The names. The codes. Your husband was keeping a record of deals, debts, people who betrayed him. He thought it was his insurance policy. He thought he could control it. But they knew, Emma. They always knew." Emma shook her head, her mind racing. "He left this for me? But why? Why didn't he tell me anything?" The woman's gaze softened for just a second, but the hardness in her voice didn't waver. "Because he didn't want to drag you into it. He thought he could protect you. But the moment you stepped into this house, into this world, you became part of it too. And now it's too late." Emma's mind was reeling. Her world was falling apart, piece by piece. Her husband had hidden this from her, had kept her in the dark, all for her protection. And now, because of his secrets, she was in deeper danger than she could ever have imagined. The woman leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Emma's with a finality that made her blood run cold. "If you want to live, you need to forget everything you thought you knew about your husband. Forget everything. They're coming for you, and you need to be ready." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was ready for any of this, but she didn't have a choice. She had to survive, and surviving meant trusting the woman no matter how much she wanted to resist. The woman's gaze never wavered, and as she turned to walk toward the back of the house again, she muttered just loud enough for Emma to hear. "We don't have much time," and Emma knew deep down that the clock was ticking. The storm was coming that Emma's heart raced as the woman's words echoed in her mind. "We don't have much time," the weight of them pressed down on her, suffocating her. Her body was frozen in place, every instinct telling her to run, to hide, but there was nowhere left to hide. She glanced at the list on the table, the names still blurring before her eyes. The connections, the codes, the mysteries, all tied to her husband. To the life she never knew. The life that had now cost him his life, and was now threatening hers. The woman moved through the kitchen with purpose, her steps quick, deliberate. Emma watched her, still struggling to process everything. The woman was planning something. Emma could feel it, could sense the shift in the air. She opened a cupboard and pulled out a small black bag, a tactical-looking backpack. Without a word, she began packing it with supplies. Cans of food, a flashlight, a first aid kit. Emma's pulse quickened. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. The woman didn't look up, but her voice was steady. "We're leaving. Now." "Leaving?" Emma's stomach churned. "But where will we go? They'll be looking for us." The woman zipped up the bag with a swift motion. "We don't have a choice. The longer we stay, the more likely they are to find us. And trust me, they won't stop until they do." Emma took a deep breath, her thoughts racing. She couldn't even begin to fathom the danger they were in, but she had no other choice. She had to move, or she'd be dead the moment they found her. "All right," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm coming." The woman nodded, as though she had expected Emma's response. "Get your things. We leave in 5 minutes." Emma scrambled through the house, grabbing what little she had left. Her phone, the few clothes she had packed in her hurried escape, and the small, worn photograph of her husband. She stared at it for a long moment. It seemed like a lifetime ago that the picture was taken, a moment of happiness, before everything had shattered. With a final glance at the empty house that had once been her sanctuary, Emma grabbed the bag the woman had set aside for her and followed her out into the cold night. Outside, the world felt different, darker. The stars overhead seemed distant, almost unreachable. The silence pressed in on her from all sides. The only sound was the crunch of gravel underfoot as they made their way toward the car. Emma's mind kept circling back to the same question. Who were these people after me? The woman opened the car door without saying a word, and Emma climbed in, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. She wanted to ask more, to get some sort of answer that might make sense of all of this, but she knew better than to speak out of turn. The woman wasn't one for explanations. She was here to get Emma through the storm, and that was all. The engine roared to life, breaking the heavy silence. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the empty road ahead. Emma sat back in her seat, trying to calm her nerves, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She could still feel the weight of the list in her hands, still hear the woman's voice in her head. They didn't have much time. The car sped down the road, leaving the house and the past behind. The woman kept her eyes fixed ahead, her hands steady on the wheel. Emma couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Every move, every glance, filled with purpose, with urgency. They drove for miles, the landscape blurring by in the darkness. Emma felt a strange sense of disconnection, as if she were floating above her own body, watching everything unfold, but unable to control it. Hours passed in silence, the only sound the hum of the tires against the road. Emma couldn't tell where they were going, but it didn't matter. She had no choice but to follow. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice low and steady, breaking the silence. "We need to make a stop." Emma blinked, startled by the words. "What? Why?" The woman glanced at her, her gaze hard. "I know a place. It's off the grid. Safe. For now. Emma's chest tightened. How do you know it's safe? The woman's lips twisted into a brief, grim smile. Because I've been there before. And so has your husband. Emma's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she focused on the road, her expression darkening. Emma could see the tension in her shoulders, in the way her grip tightened around the steering wheel. She wasn't just taking Emma somewhere for safety. She was taking her somewhere with answers. And Emma didn't know whether that was a blessing or a curse. The woman's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, her brow furrowing for a brief moment. We're being followed. Emma's stomach dropped. Followed? By who? The woman's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. The ones who want you dead. They're not far behind. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted around the car, but there was nothing in the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness. Are we going to outrun them? Emma asked, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she accelerated, pushing the car faster down the winding road. The headlights cut through the night, but Emma could sense the danger closing in. Every minute, every second counted. The woman's eyes flicked between the rearview mirror and the road ahead, her jaw set in a firm line. We'll lose them, she said, her voice almost soothing. But not if we stay on this road. We need to turn off soon. Emma's mind raced as the car roared down the dark, empty highway. The sense of danger was overwhelming, pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the woman swerved the car sharply, taking a turn onto a narrow, unpaved road that Emma hadn't seen before. The tires screeched in protest as the car veered off course, and the speed increased. Hold on, the woman ordered, her voice sharp now. Emma gripped the seat, her heart pounding as the car skidded through the rough terrain. She couldn't see anything but the flashing lights of the headlights and the thick walls of trees on either side. The road was tight, dangerous, and somewhere behind them, she knew they were being chased. The car careened down the trail, bouncing over rocks and uneven ground. Emma's stomach twisted as she realized just how vulnerable they were. The woman's hands were steady, but Emma could feel the tension in every movement. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the woman slammed on the brakes. The car jolted to a stop. Emma's heart leaped into her throat as the woman threw the car into park. "We're here," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Now stay close. No one can know we're here." Emma looked out the window, her breath catching in her chest. A small, ramshackle cabin stood in front of them, hidden deep in the woods. It was isolated, untouched by time. But for Emma, it felt like the edge of the world, and she had no idea what lay beyond it. But she had no choice but to follow. The woman opened the door, and without a word, she stepped out. Emma hesitated for only a moment before following her, the door of the car slamming shut behind her with a sharp thud. The air was thick with tension, cold and damp, but the fear gnawing at her insides was what made the night feel unbearable. The cabin ahead of them seemed to pulse with its own dark presence, standing like a sentinel in the woods. The trees around it stood in eerie silence, casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. The only sound was the rustling of leaves underfoot as Emma stepped forward, her legs stiff, her mind still racing from the chase. The woman was already moving toward the cabin, her steps purposeful and swift. She didn't glance back to see if Emma was following, but Emma couldn't bring herself to hesitate. The woman was the only person who knew what was happening, who knew how to survive in this twisted world that Emma had been thrust into. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years. Its wooden structure was weathered, peeling in places, but still standing firm against the elements. There were no lights on, no sign of life, nothing but the dark windows staring out at the wilderness like hollow eyes. The woman reached the door, which was hanging slightly ajar. She paused just long enough to look around, her sharp gaze scanning the surroundings, before she stepped inside. Emma followed quickly, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Inside, the air was stale, the smell of dust and old wood permeating the small space. The dim light filtering through cracks in the walls revealed sparse furniture, a rickety table, a few chairs, and an old armchair in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. The place had been left in a hurry, as though someone had once lived here, but had vanished without a trace. The woman moved to the center of the room and set her bag down on the table, her movements deliberate, controlled. Emma stayed by the door, unsure of what to do or say, every fiber of her being screamed for answers, for some sense of clarity in the chaos. But she could see in the woman's face that there was no time for questions right now. "Sit," the woman ordered, not unkindly. Emma glanced at the lone chair near the wall, then sank into it slowly. Her body felt heavier than ever, the weight of everything settling on her shoulders. The woman unzipped the bag and began pulling out supplies, cans of food, a small stove, a flashlight, and a stack of papers that looked eerily similar to the ones Emma had seen before. She placed them on the table with a sigh, her brow furrowing as she scanned the contents. Emma stared at the papers, her mind still reeling from what she had just learned about her husband, about the world he'd been a part of. She couldn't stop thinking about the list, the names, the codes. And now the woman, this stranger who had saved her life, was beginning to make sense of it all. The woman set the papers down and turned to face Emma. Her gaze was steady, almost comforting in its unyielding focus. "Your husband's mess is deeper than I thought," she said quietly. "It's not just about money or power. It's about control, about secrets. And there are people out there who won't stop until they get everything they think he left behind." Emma clenched her fists in her lap, trying to make sense of the tangled mess that had been her life for the past 24 hours. "What do you mean? Why didn't he tell me any of this?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. He tried. "But when you're this deep in, it's not just about protecting yourself anymore. It's about keeping the people you love as far away from it as possible." Emma's chest tightened. She had always trusted him. She had believed in him. And now, in the blink of an eye, everything had unraveled. "Is there any way out?" Emma whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. The woman didn't answer right away. She moved to the window, looking out into the darkness, her face bathed in the soft glow of the moon. Emma could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her body seemed to brace itself against something unseen. "We have to find the people he betrayed," the woman said finally. "They're the ones who know where the real treasure is hidden, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way." Emma's stomach turned at the thought. She had no idea what treasure her husband had been hiding, but she knew one thing for certain. It had to be something more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. "They'll come after us, won't they?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman turned, her gaze now fixed on Emma, sharp and intense. "Yes, and soon. The list you found, it's just the beginning. They'll trace it back to this cabin. They'll know we're here." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her mind spun wildly as she thought of the faces of the men who might be coming for her, the dangerous shadows she couldn't escape. "They're going to find us," she said numbly, as the gravity of the situation settled in. The woman's expression didn't change. She had been waiting for Emma to understand this reality, the same way she had come to terms with it long ago. "We're going to fight back," the woman said, her voice steady now. "And we're going to take them down before they take us." Emma swallowed hard. Her mind was reeling, the storm of confusion and fear swirling in every direction. "I'm not sure I can do this," she confessed, her voice quiet, but full of an emotion she couldn't name. The woman stepped toward her, her face softening just a fraction. "You don't have a choice. They're coming for you whether you're ready or not." But if we can stay ahead of them, if we can use what your husband left behind. Emma's heart beat faster. The idea of taking down these men, her husband's enemies, the people who had destroyed her life, was almost too much to grasp. But there was no time to hesitate. "Tell me what to do," Emma said, her voice firming. The woman gave her a hard look, nodding once. "First, we get some rest. We can't do anything if we're too exhausted to think. Tomorrow, we make our move." Emma nodded, but her mind wouldn't let her sleep. Every moment felt like it was a step closer to something horrible, something inevitable. But somewhere deep inside her, something else stirred. A spark of something she hadn't felt since her life had turned upside down. Survival. And the woman, for all her coldness, was the only ally Emma had in this strange new world. For now, that would have to be enough. But the next day would bring the truth, and Emma wasn't sure she was ready for that. Not at all. The cabin was silent, save for the distant sounds of wind rustling through the trees. The dim light of the moon filtered through the small gaps in the old wood, casting long shadows that stretched across the room. Emma sat on the edge of the chair, her mind racing in the dark. She tried to sleep, but the fear, the uncertainty, everything her world had become in the last few hours, kept her wide awake. The woman hadn't said much more after telling Emma they'd rest. Her cold composure never faltered. But Emma saw something else behind her eyes, something raw, something haunted. She had been through this before, and it was clear that whatever was coming next, they had to be ready. Emma's mind kept drifting back to the papers, the list, the names, the people her husband had betrayed. Was he truly the man she thought he was? Or had she been living a lie? The thought twisted her gut. Her whole life, everything she had known, seemed to be unraveling in a way she couldn't control. She couldn't shake the image of her husband's face from the photo she'd found. The man she had loved. The man who had promised to keep her safe. Had it all been a facade? Was the man she married a shadow? A part of some world she couldn't even begin to understand? Her breath hitched as she remembered the way the woman had spoken. Asterisk, they'll come after you, Emma. They won't stop until they have everything your husband left behind. Asterisk, those words echoed in her mind, sending a fresh wave of panic through her. She forced herself to stand up. The cabin felt too small, too suffocating now. Every corner seemed to hide a new fear, a new threat. There was no way to escape, no way to pretend this wasn't happening. Her eyes found the door. It was still slightly ajar, but the woman hadn't locked it. Had she been waiting for someone to enter? Or was it an invitation to leave? The thought of running, of just disappearing into the woods, crossed Emma's mind. But where would she go? She had nothing left, no family, no safety. Suddenly, the door creaked open fully. The woman stood there, silhouetted in the faint moonlight, her figure sharp against the dark. Her eyes were narrowed, and for the first time since Emma had met her, there was something vulnerable in her gaze. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but urgent. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She nodded, the instinct to follow her unspoken. The woman turned and moved into the night, toward the edge of the trees. Emma hesitated only for a second before grabbing her jacket and stepping out into the cool air behind her. The moon was high now, casting a pale, eerie glow over the forest. The trees seemed to press in around them, the shadows growing longer as they walked. Emma's breath hung in the air, visible in the cold, as her feet crunched through the dry leaves beneath her. They didn't speak for a long while, but Emma's nerves were on edge. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made her jump. They were too exposed out here. The woman finally spoke, her voice softer now, as though the dark itself had stolen her usual confidence. "You need to understand something, Emma," she said, stopping and turning to face her. "You're not just a victim in this. You're a part of it. whether you want to be or not." Emma stopped in her tracks. "What do you mean?" The woman's eyes softened for the first time, but the hardness in her voice remained. "Your husband, he wasn't just some businessman. He was part of something bigger. A criminal empire. A secret network that no one knows about. And he was trying to take it down from the inside." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The word seemed too unreal to grasp. "You're saying my husband was a criminal?" Emma's voice shook with disbelief. The woman shook her head slowly. "He wasn't a criminal in the way you think. He didn't want to be, but he got caught up in it. At first, it was just business. Then it was survival. And by the time he realized how deep he was, it was too late. He was trapped." Emma staggered back a step. Her mind couldn't process it all. Her husband, a criminal empire? No, he wasn't like that. "He always told me he wanted out," Emma said, shaking her head. "He said we'd have a normal life. We were happy. We had plans. He wasn't like them." The woman's gaze was direct, unflinching. "He tried to leave, tried to walk away. But once you're in this world, there's no way out. He couldn't get out, not without risking everything." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "And now, it's your turn." Emma's mind reeled. She was caught in this? How? How had everything she thought was true, everything she had trusted, been a lie? "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice rising with frustration. "Why didn't you warn me before all of this? Before it all fell apart?" The woman's expression softened, but it was brief. "Because you didn't need to know. You didn't need to carry this burden." But now, she paused, scanning the trees around them, her posture suddenly tense. "Now it's too late. They'll come for you soon. And when they do, you won't have a choice but to fight back." Emma swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry like sandpaper. She could feel the weight of her husband's secrets pressing down on her like 1,000 bricks. "How do I fight back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman looked at her for a long time, as if weighing something. Then, with a sigh, she nodded. "I'll teach you. We'll start with the basics. But you have to trust me, Emma. You have to do exactly what I say, no hesitation. Because if you don't," she trailed off, her eyes cold now, hard as stone. "They'll make sure you don't get another chance." Emma felt her legs weaken beneath her, the reality settling in like a cold stone in her chest. She had no choice. There was no escape from this world now. She had to survive. And for that, she had to become something she wasn't sure she could be. The woman turned and began walking back toward the cabin. "We don't have much time," she said, voice clipped. "They'll be here by morning." Emma followed her, each step feeling heavier than the last. The fear still gripped her heart, but there was something else now. A flicker of resolve. Survival. She had to survive, and to do that, she would have to become someone she had never imagined. The first lesson was waiting. The cabin loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the cold night sky. The woman led Emma back inside, her movements sharp, urgent. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, every step feeling like a beat closer to the unknown. Her mind was a blur. Too many questions, too many fears swirling in her head. The woman didn't wait for Emma to sit down. She immediately moved to the corner of the room where a small wooden crate sat beneath the table. She knelt down, lifting the lid with practiced ease, revealing a set of tools that Emma hadn't noticed before. Knives, ropes, a set of lockpicks, and a variety of small, gleaming objects that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, watching the woman work with quiet precision. The flickering shadows from the dim light seemed to dance over her face, revealing the cold determination in her eyes. She didn't seem surprised. She didn't seem afraid. "Sit," the woman repeated, her voice sharper now. "We don't have time for you to stand there like a deer in headlights." Emma snapped out of her stupor, her body responding before her mind could catch up. She sat at the table, the chair creaking beneath her as she glanced at the tools, then back at the woman. What? What are you doing? Emma asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound steady. The woman didn't look at her as she worked, but spoke in a low, measured tone. You need to learn how to defend yourself. I don't care if you think you're not cut out for it, Emma. You're in this now, whether you like it or not. And they won't care if you're scared, if you're unprepared. They'll just come for you. Emma felt a cold sweat on the back of her neck. But I don't know how to do any of this. The woman's eyes flicked up, finally meeting Emma's gaze. You'll learn. And you'll learn fast, or you won't make it out alive. Your husband didn't leave you just a mess of criminal debts. He left you something else, a key, a way to end this. But you need to understand how to use it. Emma's throat tightened. What key? What do you mean? What is this all about? The woman set down a small, sleek black device onto the table. A device Emma recognized immediately. It was a phone, but not like any she had ever seen. It was a burner phone, stripped down and hardened. No identifying marks, no distinguishing features. Only one thing stood out. A single text message that was still open on the screen. Her breath hitched as she read the words. Asterisk, they'll kill her. She's the key asterisk. Emma blinked, her hands shaking. What does this mean? What's going on? The woman didn't answer at first. Instead, she grabbed the phone and slid it across the table to Emma, her eyes piercing through her. That's for you. That message is a warning. It's also a clue. The woman they're referring to, it's you, Emma. Emma recoiled, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. Me? I don't understand. What does that mean? The woman sighed, placing her hands flat on the table as if weighing something. She studied Emma for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, her voice dropped to a softer tone. Your husband didn't just get involved in criminal dealings. He wasn't just running money or laundering goods. He was tangled in something bigger, something global. A network that operates in the shadows, out of reach of the law. And you? You're the only thing that can bring it down. Emma's head spun. What? What do you mean? The woman leaned in slightly, her voice dropping further. Your husband found something that could unravel everything these people have built. And before he died, he hid it. Hid it in you. A chill ran down Emma's spine. Hid it in me? The woman nodded. The message makes it clear. You're carrying the key to taking down the entire network. The only problem is they know that too. They'll stop at nothing to find you. Emma's mind was a whirlpool of confusion, every word from the woman sinking deeper, pulling her further from what she had once known as reality. But I don't even know what this key is. What does it look like? Where is it? The woman stood up, walking toward the back of the cabin, her movements tense. I don't know yet, but we're going to figure it out. There's a safe house not far from here. We need to get there before they find us. Safe house, Emma asked, standing up. Are we running? What about the phone? What about... We're not running, the woman interrupted, her voice steel. We're preparing. You need to be ready. We don't have the luxury of time. Emma followed the woman to the back of the cabin, where a dusty map lay on the table, edges curled with age. The woman spread it out, tracing lines across the topographical grid with a thin finger. There's a place, she said, her eyes never leaving the map. A place that holds answers. Your husband was there once, and you'll go there next. But what if they're already there? Emma asked, her heart racing again. The reality was suffocating her. Every moment, another step closer to a truth she wasn't ready to confront. They will be, the woman said, turning to face her, her face hard and unreadable. But we'll be ready. You will be ready. Emma stared at the map, but her mind was elsewhere. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but none of it made sense. How could she be the key? How could she possibly bring down a global criminal empire? The woman stood behind her, now fully armored in the cold determination she had shown from the start. Emma swallowed hard, looking at the dark line that ran through the map. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, barely audible. "I don't want any part of this." The woman's eyes softened, but only for a moment. Then she stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't have a choice. This is who you are now, Emma. You're a part of this, whether you like it or not." Emma nodded slowly, her mind processing the words. She had no choice. She knew that now. No way to run, no way to hide. It was fight or die. And for the first time, she wasn't sure which one scared her more. The weight of the moment settled over Emma like a heavy cloak. The woman's words, cold and unyielding, echoed in her mind. Asterisk, you don't have a choice. This is who you are now. Asterisk, the reality of it all. The criminals, the danger, her husband's betrayal, felt like a tightening noose. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, staring at the map before her, the dark lines and symbols that meant nothing to her. She wanted to scream, to lash out at the woman for dragging her into this nightmare. But deep down, she knew she had no one else to turn to. The woman was right. There was no escape. "Where do we go from here?" Emma asked, her voice strained, barely above a whisper. She felt small, powerless, as though the floor had been pulled out from under her and she was falling fast into a void. The woman glanced up from the map, her expression unreadable. "We head for the safe house. We gather everything we need, and then we move. They'll be closing in on us soon." Emma's stomach twisted at the thought. The idea of being hunted, of being the prey in this game of shadows, made her skin crawl. She glanced around the room, as though the walls themselves might betray her, as though the very air was thick with the presence of unseen eyes. The woman was already moving toward the door, pulling her jacket tight around her body. "We need to move fast. Stay close. Stay quiet. Don't trust anyone." Emma nodded numbly, the urgency in the woman's tone cutting through her haze of disbelief. The reality was clear now. She had no choice. The world she knew, the life she had carefully built with her husband, was gone. The woman opened the door with a swift motion and stepped out into the dark night, the cold air hitting Emma like a slap to the face. She hesitated for only a moment before following, the sound of her boots crunching in the dry leaves sending sharp echoes into the silence of the forest. The moon hung high above, casting long shadows across the ground, illuminating their path just enough to see the edge of the trees ahead. Emma's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as she tried to steady herself, to find some semblance of control. But the fear still gripped her, tight and unyielding. They moved quickly, walking in silence, only the occasional snap of a twig breaking the stillness. Emma's mind raced, every step taking her further from everything she had known. The fear of what lay ahead, the unknown, the danger, the people chasing her, was overwhelming. But there was something else too, a strange, gnawing sensation that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the realization that, in some twisted way, she was already lost. And maybe, deep down, part of her had always known that. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of a clearing. In the distance, a small cabin stood nestled between the trees, its lights dim but visible from where they stood. The woman stopped abruptly, her body tense as she scanned the surroundings, her eyes darting from tree to tree as though searching for something. Emma's heart thudded in her chest, her mind racing again. Was this the safe house? Was it safe? The woman glanced at her, her face shadowed in the dim light. "Stay close. We don't know who's inside." The door to the cabin was ajar, and they moved silently toward it, each step measured, careful. The woman was in front, her movements smooth, as though she had done this 100 times before. Emma followed, her heart pounding, a sick feeling growing in her stomach. As they neared the door, the woman held up her hand, signaling Emma to stop. She crouched low, peering through the crack in the door. Emma did the same, her breath catching in her throat as she squinted into the darkness inside. There was someone inside, a man sitting at a table, his back to them. He was alone, but there was something about the way he sat. Too still, too quiet, that set Emma's nerves on edge. He wasn't just waiting, he was expecting them. The woman motioned for Emma to stay back as she moved forward, her hand sliding into her jacket to pull out a small gun. Emma's eyes widened. She had no idea the woman was armed. "Stay behind me," the woman whispered. Emma barely had time to process the command before the woman swung the door open and stepped inside, the gun raised, her posture tense and ready. "Don't move," the woman said sharply, her voice cutting through the stillness of the cabin. "We're not here for trouble, but we'll make trouble if we have to." The man at the table didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly turned his head, his face pale and drawn, eyes sharp and calculating. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice gravelly. "Took you longer than I thought." Emma's throat constricted. She had no idea who this man was, but the way he looked at her sent a chill through her bones. The woman didn't lower her gun. "Who are you?" The man chuckled darkly. "You don't recognize me, do you?" "Not surprising. I've been out of the picture for a while. But your husband, he left me with a little gift. You're the one I'm looking for, Emma. You're the key." Emma's heart stopped. The key. The words hung in the air, like a noose around her neck. The man stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "You don't know what you have, do you? Your husband thought he could keep this from me, but you're too late. You're already in it, whether you like it or not." Emma's pulse raced. She looked at the woman, whose expression was stone cold. "We don't have much time," the woman said, her voice barely audible, her eyes never leaving the man. But Emma wasn't listening anymore. The world had just shifted beneath her feet. Her husband's secrets were no longer abstract. They were here, standing in front of her. And she didn't have the faintest idea what would happen next. But one thing was clear. It was too late to go back. The game had already begun. The man's words hung in the air, like an omen, suffocating the space between them. Emma's breath hitched, her body frozen, caught in a web she hadn't asked for, a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The woman beside her, still with the gun drawn, didn't flinch, but her eyes flickered with a hint of something, recognition maybe? Caution? Emma couldn't tell. The man didn't step forward. He only stood there, watching them with a smirk that tugged at the edges of his lips. His eyes locked onto Emma's, and she felt a sickening shiver crawl up her spine. "You still don't get it, do you?" His voice was smooth, too smooth. "Your husband left you a path, Emma, a legacy. It's all in your hands now." Her pulse raced. "What do you mean? What path? What legacy?" The words felt like they were being pulled out of her, each syllable more desperate than the last. The man's lips parted in a slow, deliberate grin. He thought he could escape. He thought he could protect you from all of this. But he didn't know what he was up against. And neither do you. Emma's head was spinning. Every word felt like a hammer pounding against her skull. The weight of his gaze was suffocating, the truth of his words piercing through the fog of disbelief that had clouded her mind since the night had begun. The woman beside her didn't lower the gun, but she did step forward, her voice low and cold. "Enough games. Who are you?" The man's expression shifted, the grin fading into something darker, more menacing. "I'm the man your husband tried to keep you away from. The one who controls everything. The one who has everything." He walked closer, each step deliberate. Emma's heart thudded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She could almost feel the gun at her back, the weight of it, the coldness of the metal pressed against her spine. I came for what's mine, he said, his voice almost a whisper now. And you, Emma, you're the key to unlocking it. The woman next to her tensed, her hand tightening around the gun. What is it? She demanded. What does she have? The man's eyes glinted. Oh, it's not a thing. It's something much more valuable. Emma's throat tightened. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the edge of the table to steady herself. What is it? Tell me. Her voice cracked with the weight of the fear and confusion that had been building inside her since the moment she had stumbled into this hell. The man's grin returned, but it was cold and unforgiving. Your husband's secret, the one he hid from everyone. It's a name, a list of people he was going to expose, and you're the last one who can unlock it. Emma's blood ran cold. A list. Was this the key? Was she the one who could bring it all down? The weight of it crashed into her like a physical blow. The woman stepped forward, gun raised. What do you want from her? The man held up his hands, feigning innocence. I don't want anything from her. She's already carrying it. She just doesn't know it yet. Emma's breath came faster now, her chest tightening. She could barely understand the words that were spilling from his mouth, but one thing was clear. There was no going back. She was the key. She had always been the key. In that moment, it clicked. The weight of it. The truth that had been buried beneath layers of lies and deception. Asterisk, her husband, had trusted her with this. He had left her the legacy asterisk. The room fell silent, the stillness broken only by the sound of the wind outside. The woman's gun never wavered, but Emma could see the tension in her posture. She could feel it too, the danger, the stakes. The man watched them both, a predator's smile curling at his lips. But Emma wasn't going to wait for him to make the first move. With one swift motion, she grabbed the gun from the woman's hand. The man's eyes widened in surprise. I'm done being a pawn, Emma said, her voice steady now, even as her hands shook. If you want this legacy, you're going to have to kill me. For the first time that night, Emma felt in control. Her heart raced, but it wasn't from fear, it was from power, from the realization that she was no longer just a victim. She was the one who would decide how this story ended. The man's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. He didn't move, didn't speak. He only stood there watching her, as if weighing her words. And in that stillness, with the gun in Emma's hands and the legacy of her husband's secret hanging over her, she knew one thing for certain. The game had just changed. The tension in the cabin hung thick in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emma's fingers tightened around the cold steel of the gun, her heart beating erratically, but with a clarity she hadn't known before. The man across from her, who had controlled everything in the shadows, now stood vulnerable before her. For a fleeting moment, she considered what her husband might have thought, what he might have wanted for her in this twisted game. But the thoughts didn't linger. There was no time for them. The man's gaze never wavered. His smirk had disappeared completely, replaced by something darker, something Emma couldn't quite place. Was it fear, or something worse? Go ahead, he said finally, his voice low. Pull the trigger. Prove you've got what it takes. But Emma didn't move. Her hand remained steady on the gun, the cold weight of it grounding her. But her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 possibilities. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ending the cycle, about taking control of her own fate. I'm not like him, Emma said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the man or to herself. I won't become a killer. The words hung in the air for a moment, and the man's face twisted into a knowing look. He stepped back, as if conceding defeat, but his eyes never left her. You think you have a choice? The woman beside Emma, still silent until now, shifted, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she moved forward, placing her hand on Emma's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. You don't need to kill him, she murmured. You just need to survive. That's what he wants, to drag you down into the same darkness. Don't let him. Emma's breath caught. It was like the fog that had clouded her mind all night suddenly lifted. She didn't need to play by their rules. She didn't need to become a monster to stop them. Her fingers slowly released the pressure on the trigger. She lowered the gun. The man let out a short laugh, but there was something brittle in it now. "You think you've won, don't you?" he sneered. "No," Emma said, meeting his eyes, her voice steady. "But I've finally realized what I need to do." With that, she turned away from him. The woman, still with her hand on Emma's arm, nodded in approval. The man's laughter turned hollow, fading as they walked out of the cabin, the door closing softly behind them. Outside, the night air was still, the cold biting at Emma's skin. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. It wasn't over. The road ahead was still dangerous. The legacy her husband left behind would haunt her for a long time. But for the first time in weeks, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from fear. Freedom from the lies. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the one who would make the choices from here on out. And whatever came next, she knew she would face it, not as a pawn, but as someone who had learned to stand tall, in control of her own fate. The woman beside her gave her a sharp, knowing look as they walked into the night. It wasn't over, but it was a new beginning, and that, Emma realized, was all she needed.